All right. Well, we're continuing our adventures with Paul in the book of Acts. We're in chapter 23 if you want to find your place there. We're winding our way down in the book of Acts and consequently winding our way down in Paul's life. When we left Paul, if you remember, Paul had made his way to Jerusalem at the conclusion of his third missionary journey. He goes to Jerusalem. There is a huge misunderstanding that takes place while Paul is in Jerusalem. Some people see Paul going into the temple with a couple of other men, and they assume that Paul is bringing Gentiles into the temple and thus defiling the temple. It was a total misunderstanding. Paul wasn't doing that at all, but, sometimes people think they see what they don't see, which I think is a lesson to us all today, that before you start spreading rumors about someone or something, you better make sure that what you're saying is true, because these men thought they saw something that they didn't see. But a huge riot takes place, and so the Roman official, he goes in and he basically arrests Paul, but he kind of does it for Paul's own protection more than anything, to save him from the crowd. And so, and this official's name is Claudius Lysias. We find that out in some of the material that we'll be reading tonight. So Claudius Lysias, in an attempt, he tries to find out what everything's going on, what's about, and he finds out that these people are upset over what he perceives to be breach of Jewish law or Jewish etiquette concerning the temple. And so he says, well, I don't know anything about Jewish law. I'm a Roman. So easiest way to settle this is to bring in the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, and let's air this out between Paul and the Sanhedrin. And Claudius Lysias' idea was he was going to kind of moderate this thing. You ever had two warring factions that you tried to get in the middle of and moderate? It's a sticky situation, but that's kind of the situation that Claudius finds himself in. And so that's where we pick up in verse 1 of chapter 23. Let's take a look. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, "Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day." And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law?" And those who stood by said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" Then Paul said, "I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, I want you to watch what Paul does. He's slick here. When Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, "We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God." Now, when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the barracks. But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome." Okay, let's talk a little bit about this. So Claudius Lysias says, "Okay, Paul, I'm going to have you present your case in front of the Jewish Sanhedrin." Why would he do that? I think I gave you the answer a minute ago, really. Yeah, he's like, I'm not a Jew. He saw that it was a matter of Jewish law, so he said, well, who better to sort out a question of Jewish law than the Jewish council of the Sanhedrin? So that's why he calls them in. Now, if you notice, there's some things that are very reminiscent in Paul's appearance before the Sanhedrin. That is very reminiscent of Jesus' appearance before the Sanhedrin. What are some things that you see that kind of remind you of when Jesus appeared before the Sanhedrin? So they struck him. So that's they strike Jesus, they strike him. Paul calls the high priest a whitewashed wall. That's very reminiscent of something that Jesus might say to the Pharisees, you whitewashed sepulchres. Also, if you notice with Jesus, the Jews, particularly the Sanhedrin, they wanted Jesus dead. The Romans, as voiced by Pontius Pilate, they really wanted to release, they had no beef with Jesus. They wanted to release Jesus. But the Sanhedrin wanted Jesus dead. And if you look at Paul here, Claudius Lysias, it would seem, and certainly if you look at the letter that he writes, that we're going to be looking at in just a little bit, he writes a letter to Felix. You get the idea that he really would like to just release Paul, but he's afraid of the Jews. He's afraid of the crowd. But the Jews want Paul dead. So there's a lot of similarities. Now, I wanted to park on this for just a second because there's some theological truth here that we'll miss if we don't and ethical truth that we'll miss if we're not careful. So get the picture. Paul is testifying before the Sanhedrin, and the high priest orders Paul to be struck, slapped, beaten, punched, whatever, however you want to interpret that word. And Paul says, God's going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. He said, you sit and judge me according to the law, and you're doing things contrary to the law by having me struck for no reason. And one of the people standing there says, how dare you talk about the high priest that way? And Paul says, I want you to see this. Paul says, oh, I'm sorry. I did not know he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, you all make the application and tell me how that pertains to today. I know you see it. I know you know it. So, as people of God, we are commanded to submit to those in authority over us, and that includes not just what we do, but also what we say. And that goes from everything to your husband, to the police officer, to your pastor, to the President of the United States. And let me say this, and I'm sure none of y'all would ever have been involved in any of this, but I have heard, I'm talking over the history of my ministry. I've heard Christians, I'm not talking about lost people, I'm talking about Christians who are supposed to be people of God, say the most godless, disrespecting things of the President of the United States, the man who holds the highest office in the country, and they speak about him in terms that they wouldn't use to speak about Satan. I'm sorry. That is unbiblical. It's ungodly. You may not like the man who's the president. You may not agree with it. Paul didn't necessarily agree with the high priest or probably like him. But he understood that he held a position of authority and he respected the office, even though he didn't necessarily respect the man. We're told to submit to those in authority over us, and you don't get the disclaimer of, well, if you like him, if you agree with him. Not saying you have to like him or agree with him, but you're supposed to submit to him, and you're not supposed to say bad things. I mean, I used to get emails from church members, and not this church, but like church members. I mean, like disparaging the President of the United States, things that, that Christians shouldn't say about anybody, but especially the President of the United States. Now, we're very blessed because we live in a country that if you don't like the President, every 4 years we get to reshuffle the deck and draw a new hand. Okay, so, in a couple of years we get to try again. If you're not happy with who we got now, you get to try again in a couple of years. But until that time, as people of God, then we're supposed to pray for our those in authority over us. We're supposed to submit to their authority, and we're supposed to not speak evil of them. And it's not just the president, it's the government. But I'm saying president because I feel like there's more of a temptation to do it over the president than the governor, particularly the governor now. I think most people like the governor. So, and it goes for it goes from the police officer that writes you the speeding ticket because you were doing something you weren't supposed to be doing. It's across the board. So anyway, that's my soapbox for tonight, but I didn't want to pass over that. Let me pause and see if your questions or comments on that. Yes, ma'am. Right. In other words, the high priest ordered this guy to hit Paul. And he's saying, you're sitting and trying to judge me based on the law, and you're ordering me hit, which is against the law. Yes, ma'am. Say what? This was at the fortress of Antonia, where the Roman soldier. It's in Jerusalem, where the barracks of the soldiers' barracks. Probably. He hadn't been in Jerusalem for several years, so he wouldn't have necessarily known. Because the Sanhedrin is made up of several men. He wouldn't have necessarily known who the high priest was. And he says, I don't know. I didn't know he was the high priest. Yeah. So, it seems they know who Paul is for sure. Paul has a reputation. So. Do what? Right. Yeah. Right. Yes. Right. I don't. Probably the Son. I don't have that right in front of me. Can you Google that, Lisa, and see if Ananias is the son of Caiaphas? She's Googling it. Right. So he would have been a descendant. So you're talking son-in-law. son-in-law. So, okay. Right. Right. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, I didn't necessarily want to just like go off on a rampage on that, but I think it is something that I, I, I honestly, and I mean, I'm trying to give everybody the benefit of that. I really think that it's something that Christians don't even know or think about. You know, like, oh well, if they're on the wrong side of the political fence than I am, then it's free game to say whatever I want to. No, not really. So anyway, that's the only reason I point that out at all. Okay, let's move on. How does okay, what issue caused the dissension of the Sanhedrin? Okay, this is what I said. See how slick Paul is here. So what is it? What does Paul use as as an issue to drive a wedge between the Pharisees and the Sadducees of the Sanhedrin? Yeah, the resurrection, because there's two parties in the Sanhedrin, kind of like we have two parties in our government. Well, they had two parties. I want to say parties. They would probably say sects, sects, sects. But for illustration purposes, I'm going to say they had two parties. They had the Pharisees and they had the Sadducees. The Pharisees, they believed in the resurrection of the dead. They believed in angels. They believed in demons and spirits, miracles, all of those things. And the Sadducees believed in none of those things. Sanhedrin didn't believe in resurrection, so they were sad. You see, ha ha ha. That one predates me. That was a children's Sunday school. When I was a kid in Sunday school, that was how they taught us to tell the difference between. There's some 150-year-old man that goes around to all the children's Sunday school classes doing that bad joke, I think. Anyway, so he brings up and he says, "I'm a Pharisee and I'm here for the hope of the resurrection. I'm on trial for the hope of the resurrection." And so then the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they start arguing amongst themselves, and then some on the Pharisee side, they say, "Well, I don't see anything wrong with this man. What if a spirit spoke to him? Who are we to say?" And so that he uses that to kind of, I don't know. It's like one of those old cartoons, the Bugs Bunny, where they're in this place and they get a fight started between the two groups, and then he crawls out from under it. I don't know. You almost get the idea that was Paul's idea, but he's not going to crawl out of this one. But that seems to be kind of how this is going at this point. But he says, "I'm here for the hope I'm on trial because of the hope of Jesus." Questions on that set of verses? Yes, sir. Well, they, like Paul would say, they've been blinded by the God of this age. Speaking of the Jews, Paul would say, even today, when Moses is read, talking about the law of Moses, that a veil remains over their eyes. So, he seems to hint at a time before the end where the veil would be lifted and they would see and understand Jesus as the Messiah, but apparently it hasn't been lifted yet because there's still very few Jews that are coming to Christ. Yes. Right. The Sadducees. Yeah. Angels, demons, spirits, miracles. So yeah, they pretty much had a very bland view of God and the spiritual side of things. Okay, well, let's look on verse 12, see what Paul's going to get himself in this time. "When it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Now there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. They came to the chief priests and elders and said, 'We have bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul. Now you therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him, but we are ready to kill him before he comes near. So when Paul's sister's son, that would be his nephew, heard of their ambush, he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you." The commander took him by the hand and went aside and asked privately, What is it that you have to tell me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him. But do not yield to them, for more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, men who have bound themselves by an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man depart and commanded him, "Tell no one that you have revealed these things to me." So Paul's nephew gets wind of a plot that these 40 some odd men have sworn an oath that we're not going to eat anything until we have killed Paul. And so Paul's nephew goes to the commander, or he goes to Paul first, and Paul says, "Take this man to the commander." And so the nephew kind of spills the beans on the plot to kill Paul. So why do you think the Jews hated Paul so much that they wanted to kill him? That's pretty strong stuff. Why did they hate him so much? He was going to the Gentiles, and they obviously didn't like the Gentiles. What else? Yeah. They didn't like the message, which was Christ crucified. They didn't like him because they couldn't prove him wrong. You know, they tried so hard. It's just like with Jesus. They tried so hard to prove Jesus wrong. And every time they thought they had him in a dilemma, he always seemed to have the right answer to silence the critics. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Whose inscription is this on this coin? Well, it's Caesar's. Well, then render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and Caesar's, and the things unto God, the things that are God's. And they had nothing to say. Well, Paul, they couldn't quiet him either. They had no answer for him. They couldn't prove him wrong. They were pretending to be what Paul really was. They were pretending to be the people of God that Paul really was. And people who pretend to be people of God will always hate the people who really are. You can write that one down in your notebook if you want to. The people who are pretending to be the people of God will always hate those who really are. And so the Jews who were pretending to be God's people hated Paul the most because he was what they were pretending to be but were not. But God is at work, and God delivers Paul. How does he work through various people to defeat the plot of the Jews? He works through at least a couple of people. The nephew, for sure, to get the word to the governor Claudius Lysias, or the commander, and he works through Claudius Lysias. Claudius Lysias is the one that kind of rescues him to start with. It's Claudius Lysias who's not going to turn him over to them for this ambush. He's going to send Paul on his way with all this guard, like 150 soldiers. He's going to send with Paul to make sure that he arrives to Caesarea safely. So God is at work through all of this. No one's going to take Paul's life before it's time for Paul to go. So there's comfort in that. None of us are leaving this place till God gets ready for us, and I think that's comforting as well. Plots of man and plots of Satan can't prevail if God wants you here. Yes. Yeah, that's true. It seems as though this Claudius Lysias he knew that, very much like Pontius Pilate with Jesus. He knew that Paul was innocent, but yet he was more afraid of people than God, which is sadly the story with a lot of people today. It's not as though they don't know the truth, but people become more concerned with what people think than what God thinks. And that was Pilate's problem. That's Claudius Lysias' problem, and it seems to be many people's problem today. All right, questions on those verses? All right, well, let's move on then to verse 23, see what Paul gets himself into. Verse 23. He called for, now this is Claudius Lysias, he called for 2 centurions, saying, prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea. Now, okay, I want you to understand the overkill here. There's 40 men who have made a vow to kill Paul. This is the force that accompanies Paul to Caesarea. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. I mean, that's a mighty force. They're going to make sure Paul gets there in one piece. To Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night, which would be like 9 o'clock in the p.m. Provide mounts to set Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. He wrote a letter in the following manner: Claudius Lysias to the most excellent governor Felix. Now I want you to see the smooze that takes place here with between these officials. All right, watch this. Greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with troops, I rescued him. That's a little bit of a gloss there, but anyway. Having learned that he was a Roman, when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council. I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell. Then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. The next day they left the horsemen to go on with him and return to the barracks. When they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers also have come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. All right, so he's carried under guard to Caesarea Maritime, where he will be held in prison there until the Jews arrive. And that's going to be kind of he's just going to kind of sit there for a couple of years, because there's really not, it's kind of like they're not there. They don't show up. So he's just kind of held there. But we'll get into that next time. So Paul sends to Felix, the governor of that region, and he's sending Paul primarily for 3 reasons. Why? Why is he sending him to Felix? He's a Roman citizen, so that's certainly one reason. What else? Well, he didn't have anything to charge. He's been charged with a capital crime. The Jews want him dead. But he says, I didn't really see anything. He says, I didn't find anything deserving of death to him. But being charged with a capital crime, he's kind of saying, this is over my head. This is, this is kind of like if you go to, what's the little small claims court, Judge Judy. If you go before Judge Judy and, and you're accusing someone of murder, I started to say she might not. She might try the thing herself. But, she would probably say, okay, this is beyond my scope of authority. So he's sending him on. And then also there was this threat from these 40 conspirators. So he feared for keeping Paul in Jerusalem wasn't safe because his life was in danger. So for Paul's safety, he sends him on to Caesarea Maritime. Also because he was a Roman citizen and because he was charged with a capital crime. Claudius Lysias finds it the best idea to send him on to Caesarea to Felix. That name is forever corrupted for me because I grew up as a kid watching Felix the cat. Felix the cat, the wonderful, wonderful cat. So now I read. Of course, it's like I can't read the book of Hosea and his wife Gomer. I mean, like I'm forever, Gomer Pyle, USMC. I don't know. So some names are just ruined for us, I guess. There's clues, if you read carefully, there's clues in Claudius's letter that indicate he really believed Paul was innocent. What do you see in there that makes you think he believes Paul to be innocent? Yeah, he said it's questions over their law. In other words, nothing over the Roman law. What did you say, Miss Coy? Yeah. So it's Jewish law. Also, he says, I've questioned him and I found what? Nothing deserving of death. Who does that sound like? Does it not sound like Pilate when he's trying Jesus? He mentions the fact that Paul is a Roman citizen. So it's almost like he's setting up this thing with Felix like, hey, it's us Romans against the Jews, and this guy's a Roman, and these Jews are trying to get him. It's kind of one of those deals, And he makes mention of the fact that I rescued him. The Jews were out to get him, but I rescued him. That's not exactly how it went down, but I guess he's stretching it a little bit to make himself. He does what many of us do. He's telling the story in such a way to make himself look as best as possible. My dad was an artist at that. He could take and tell the story in such a way that he's not really misrepresenting the truth. He's just telling the truth in such a way to cast himself in the best light possible. So I feel like that's what Claudius is doing here. And did you notice another thing that very reminiscent of the trial of Jesus is how Paul gets shifted back and forth between one court and another. You remember it was the Sanhedrin with Jesus. It was the Sanhedrin, and then it was Pilate, and then it was Herod, and then it was back to Pilate, and finally Pilate hands him over, to the Sanhedrin and says, you do what you want to. I'm washing my hands of it. So here you've got Paul, who starts out, it starts out as a Jewish dispute. The Roman Claudius Lysias steps in. Then he calls in the Sanhedrin. Then he sends him to the governor Felix. Then eventually, and we'll see that probably next time, where Felix is succeeded by Festus, another name that's corrupted for us forever. And then ultimately he will appeal before or give his case before Agrippa. That'll be that very famous, almost you persuade me to be a Christian. And Paul said, I would to God that I in a short time or a long time persuade not just you, but everyone here to be just like me, except for these chains. We'll look at that probably next time. Yes. I'm sorry, what? took place at night, yes. So, yeah. And there's some symbolism in that. I mean, it's all kind of cloak and dagger under the cover of darkness, because what we're really doing isn't legitimate, so we've got to kind of hide it in the night, that kind of thing. I don't know that I can answer it, but yeah. Did they ever eat anything? Yeah. I don't know. When you get to heaven, you can ask Jesus that. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. The Paul Harvey. When you get to heaven, you can ask Jesus or Paul Harvey and get the rest of the story of it. So. Do what now? So 40 has some spiritual significance. 40 days in the wilderness, 40 years that Israel wandered, 40 days and 40 nights. So there is some symbol. Although I don't know that this particular instance there's symbolism in it, or just happened to be 40 men that huh? I'm sure that Paul must have understood the resemblance to his situation in Christ. And you know what I believe? I believe it thrilled him to death. Because I think he realized, I am suffering in the same manner that my Lord did, and I think it thrilled him. I really do. Yeah, I think he counted it the greatest honor. So, what lessons do we learn from this passage about God's provisional care? In verse 11, Paul gets a vision from the Lord, where Jesus says to him, "Be of good cheer, Paul, as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness in Rome." So Jesus comes to him in a vision and says, "You're going to make it to Rome." Now, he doesn't really say what's going to happen to him once he gets to Rome, but he says, "You're going to make it to Rome, and you're going to testify of me there." And he's spared from the ambush. So God's taking care of him. Paul's not going to die until God's ready for him to die. Just like Jesus said, I lay down my life. No one takes it from me. Paul was going to die when God got ready for him, in the manner that God had chosen for him to die, by whom he chose for it to come. And no amount of people promising not to eat till he died or all of this, none of that would prevail, because they weren't in charge. The Sanhedrin wasn't in charge. Claudius Lysias wasn't in charge. Felix wasn't in charge. God was in charge. Just like Pontius Pilate wasn't in charge of when Jesus died, God was in charge of that. And so I think there's comfort and encouragement in that as well. You're not going anywhere until God gets ready for you to go. And it will be his choosing, not your enemies. So I think there's encouragement in that as well. All right, any questions on this? I do have a brief video. I think it's only 3 or 4 minutes long. We'll see what our friend